It does seem like this is the sort of worst acid trip that Jeremy Corbyn could ever endure. To imagine Donald Trump and Tony Blair together as the colonial masters of Gaza.
Well, maybe that's because he's a soulless man who has no hinterland, and for him the only way to feel moved is with the football.
And then David Lammy says, or rather thinks to himself, oh yes, I've got that message. I'll just go out there and say, Nigel Farage, Holocaust fan. You know, it's use these terms with care. Governments of the left have got it wrong on immigration, and there needs to be a tighter approach towards indefinite leave to remain. If Labour's moving in all of these directions, is Labour racist too? And
what would you like to see from the Conservative Party? What would your advice be?
What Emma Watson and Daniel Radcliffe should do and should have done is just say, we got this wrong. We're really sorry. This has reinforced a view that I have, which is even more unfashionable than political conservatism, which is, if I had gone to Hogwarts, I would have hoped that the Sorting Hat would have put me in Slytherin.
I'm sure it would have done, Michael.
Probably no controversy there. Hello, and welcome to Quite Right. I'm Michael Gove, editor of The Spectator.
And I'm Madeline Grant, assistant editor and parliamentary sketch writer at The Spectator.
This week we've both been in Liverpool for the Labour Party conference. I don't know what Madeline did wrong in a previous life, but she's still there. I'm in London, and we'll be reflecting on what this conference tells us about the central battle in British politics.
And a terrifying day for Jeremy Corbyn as Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump meet in Washington to agree the president's 20-point roadmap for ending the war within 2 years.
And Maddie and I will also be reflecting on who is the real villain in the Harry Potter saga.
Well, hi, Michael. I'm joining you from this lovely makeshift studio in Liverpool because I have just been watching Keir Starmer's conference speech, so I couldn't be joining you properly in London. But it's lovely to see you, and lots to talk about the last few days, and it's not over yet.
No. Well, I hot-footed it back from Liverpool this morning and taking, I think, probably the earliest train that I've been on for many years. But to be fair, it wasn't the case that I was running away. I found the Labour conference fascinating. And I took the opportunity while I was there to, it was the first Labour conference I've been to for 20 years, to sort of try to take the temperature overall. And I think in the run-up to Keir Starmer's speech, the thing I found interesting is that Labour was uniting against two common enemies, Andy Burnham and Nigel Farage. And so the sort of core Labour leadership team could unite against Andy Burnham. You know, they were the Lancastrians against this Yorkist usurper. And obviously Nigel Farage was the main, though not the only, target of Keir Starmer's speech. And I thought that Starmer's speech was, for him, better than I expected, because I think that he was trying to make an argument. I think that there were all sorts of weaknesses and, you know, dangers for him and for Labour in the argument that he was making. But so far, when Starmer has attempted to talk about patriotism, it's always seemed to me that he's been essentially playing, you know, some form of rhetorical boggle or Scrabble. He's been looking at various letters, trying to put them together in order to say patriotic, flag, renewal, in whatever order. But on this occasion, he had a sort of particular, I think flawed, attempt to say that the Britain in which he believed was a Britain built by the working class, open and inclusive, and Nigel Farage was this scandalous public school cynic who was no friend of true patriots.
Yes, I got that impression too, but it was I found it quite discordant, firstly, with many other things that Labour have been saying. I mean, until the day before yesterday, their constant refrain has been that the country is broken, that the Conservatives broke the country. It's the worst inheritance since World War II, maybe worse than World War II, who knows? And now they're saying, hang on, if you think Britain is broken, then you're not just wrong, but you're unpatriotic. How dare you talk down the country? And that felt a bit like verging on the gaslighting. He also had a warning for his delegates, which was don't patronise working class people. He talks about an old woman that he spoke to in Oldham, and he had a cup of tea and a rich tea biscuit with her, and he listened to her concerns about migration. Now, again, I was struck by the way that he was unveiling these things as if they were like groundbreaking new information, rather than like very basic politics 101 type stuff that, like, frankly, anyone with half a brain cell could have told him. And he unveiled this as if it was, you know, he expected almost to be applauded for pointing it out. It feels a bit like they've very belatedly woken up to this problem.
No, well, first of all, there was a sort of uncanny echo of Gordon Brown when he was in Rochdale, and he found a voter there in the 2010 election expressing concern about migration, and he was caught then saying to one of his aides on a microphone that he was still wearing that she was a bigoted woman. And he had to apologise for that. It was almost as though 15 years later, Keir Starmer still has to remind the Labour Party, or almost as you say, unveil it as though it were a revelation, as though it were a development in the theory of relativity, that they should be stunned and amazed that he's able to share with them, that actually listening to voters and thinking that their honest reactions might actually be worth paying attention to was an enormous revelation. Now, I suspect that what he was trying to do was to say this isn't the party of Jeremy Corbyn, this is not the party of the student left patronising our traditional supporters. But the very fact that he had to spell it out was in itself, as you say, revealing of, in a way, the fact that he can't be certain that his own party gets that message.
Yeah. And also, you know, shortly after this speech in which the Prime Minister says, don't patronise people, listen to their concerns, they send David Lammy out onto the TV studios where he says that Nigel Farage is potentially a Nazi and flirted with the Hitler Youth when he was a schoolboy. This feels quite like, I don't know, like 0 to 100. I just generally, that whole line that, well, I wonder, I know they would argue that they've said that they're not saying that everyone who votes for reform or is tempted to vote for reform is a racist, but they're proposing racist policies. Yeah. I think to many people listening, that's exactly what it will have sounded like.
Completely. It is a very, very difficult thing to do when you open the box and take out rhetoric which calls your opponent or anything associated with your opponent racist. You're escalating dramatically. It's no longer conventional. It's now political nuclear warfare. And even if you think this is a tactical nuclear weapon with a proposed narrow target, Nigel Farage's policies in a particular area, once you have a nuclear weapon in the hands of someone like David Lammy, then the consequences can be self-harming, to put it mildly. The idea that Nigel Farage, who was born in 1964, was, when he was a schoolboy in Dulwich College, signing up for the Hitler Jugend is just preposterous. And the whole point is that earlier in the day, the message had gone out to Labour cabinet ministers, don't personalise it. Don't play the man, play the ball, make it about the policy rather than the individual. And then David Lammy says, or rather thinks to himself, oh yes, I've got that message. So I'll just go out there and say, Nigel Farage, Holocaust fan. You know, it's the danger is use these terms with care.
Like, he went there, and what I loved was that Lammy not only went there, but he said, I'm not going to get into that. I'll just leave it to you, the audience, to answer the question of whether you think Nigel Farage is racist by mentioning the Nazis. You know,
yes,
he almost framed it as if he'd done the honourable thing.
No, it's the sort of thing. It's the sort of thing that Richard Nixon used to do when he said, "Under no circumstances will I refer to the fact that my opponent flirted with communism in her youth." I will absolutely in no way suggest that her Marxist years have any influence on our policy now. It's it goes back actually to Cicero. I'm not sure that Cicero and David Lammy have been in the same sentence before.
Reunited at last.
Exactly. Maybe Cicero will be David Lammy's specialist subject the next time he's on Celebrity Mastermind. But to be fair to David Lammy, the Pandora's box on this question was opened by Keir Starmer on Sunday. It was repeated in his speech, of course, as well. And his audience clearly loved it. They love the fact that
They loved it.
That he's painting Farage in these dark primary colours as this figure who has more than just a whiff of sulphur about him, who is someone who they can feel justified and moral and right in opposing. But at the same time, it creates at least three difficulties. One, hyperbole. Two, are you saying that anyone who might vote for Nigel Farage thinks he's made a good point, sympathises with one of his arguments, should automatically check themselves because they're about to enter into a satanic pit of racism themselves? And then the third thing is, if, as Labour has clearly indicated this week, governments in the past have been complacent, governments of the left have got it wrong on immigration, and there needs to be a tighter approach towards indefinite leave to remain. If Labour's moving in all of these directions, is Labour racist too? Are they the baddies too? That's the problem.
I know. And Shabana Mahmood, who I know that you admire very deeply, she said that Nigel Farage was somehow more than racist. But it's hard to explain exactly how he's more than racist. But he just is. Like, it's enough. It's enough for me to say this.
Yes, you are right. I am a fan of Shabana Mahmood's, and I do think that she is one of the most impressive people, if not the most impressive person in the Labour government, because at that fringe meeting, what struck me is that she was asked some quite tricky questions about everything from Quran burning to cousin marriage to the definition of Islamophobia and whether or not that was something Labour should pursue, to the territory that she was taking Labour into on migration and what effect that might have on how the party was seen. People can listen to it on the Spectator website. They might disagree with her arguments, but she made thoughtful and considered cases for all of the positions that she held. And I think, and this was certainly true of Keir Starmer until arguably today, that it is too often the case that politicians seek to win support by making the sorts of claims that their tribe will applaud rather than putting forward an argument. And that takes us back to the point about racism, which is that as soon as you've made that charge, you're effectively saying, don't listen to that person. Their arguments are automatically illegitimate because there is something so deeply wrong with their worldview that every single argument they make is corrupted.
Yes. The fact that Labour have unveiled something on, or are talking about amending indefinite leave to remain rules, but not going quite so drastically far as Reform have been talking about. My understanding is that Reform want to scrap indefinite leave to remain and replace it with a kind of renewable visa that gets renewed every few years. Now, Shabana Mahmood, their policy seems to be not a million miles away from that, except for they seem to have ruled out it being applied retroactively to deal with the so-called Boris wave, the large numbers of people who've arrived in the last few years. Are they perhaps overreacting? I understand, and I share this view that the idea of supplanting people who've lived in Britain for a very long time and sort of turfing them out is going to be hugely divisive and is not, I don't think, a mainstream opinion, but definitely strong. There would probably be much stronger support for people who are not born in Britain and came only very recently.
Yes.
Is there a bit of an issue where Labour have potentially closed that down? I
don't think they have. The point that Keir Starmer has made when actually in the House of Commons, he said that Boris Johnson and the Conservatives ran a one-nation experiment in open borders and that far too many people arrived. And indeed, Shabana Mahmood made that point as well. So that inevitably provokes the question, OK, far too many people came and you want to reduce the number of people who come. But if far too many people came and there are people here who have a temporary right to be here, then presumably, in some circumstances, you'd prefer it if those people left. You prefer it if there was less pressure on public services and the exchequer. You've just told us that what we have is unfair pressure that causes concern and disquiet that is legitimate, and over a cup of tea and a rich tea biscuit, you should not just patronise but sympathise with and pay close attention to these concerns. So therefore, actually, the difference between you and Nigel Farage is a matter of degree, not kind. And if you accept that, which I think is a fair analysis, and if listeners think that that's wrong or a mischaracterization, I'd love to know, then that only further invalidates the heated rhetoric directed at Farage. I mean, I actually think that, Labour's overall positioning, let's wait to see what it actually means in policy terms and delivery terms, Labour's overall positioning on this issue is sensible. But it does mean that you can't then say that Farage or Reform are illegitimate and beyond the pale, because you're in a restrictionist territory. You're not a sort of Owen Jones, Jeremy Corbyn, open borders figure anymore.
Yeah, but the fact that they have tried so hard to, by explicitly calling Reform's policy racist, is that a bit of an admission, perhaps, that they no longer think there is much hope in trying to win back certain groups of even former Labour voters who are now very tempted by Reform? Is it because that sounded to me like the kind of language you use to shore up your base?
In essence, yes. Labour and Keir Starmer say that they're the party that is opposed to division and wants to unite. But what he's chosen to do is to draw a dividing line. That is what politicians often do. The other guy believes in this. I am definitely opposed to him. He's a racist. I'm not. This is the fight of our lives. That is in itself generating division. Now, you might say, if you're a supporter of Keir Starmer, quite right to. We need to take on the populism and the cynicism of Reform. Yeah, that's perfectly legitimate. But what you are doing is inviting people to choose, and you're basically saying you're with us or against us. And, that was what George W. Bush said at the beginning of the war on terror. I don't think it's going to be the case that Keir Starmer is going to unleash the 77th Airborne on Reform HQ. But what he is saying is, this is a Manichaean division.
We probably lack the military capacity for that to be possible anymore.
Exactly. Yeah. And indeed, he'd probably worry, actually, given the sentiment, I imagine, amongst many in the military, quite, if they were asked to choose between Keir and Nigel, who they would choose. But no, you are right. It's an attempt to rally Labour to a cause and to put fire in their belly rather than an attempt to reach out. It's saying, in that sense, even though, of course, in other parts of his speech, he was very anxious to reclaim workers overall for Labour, and he had quite a trad view of who Labour's natural constituency would be. Shipyard workers, those who work for Jaguar Land Rover, those who work at the steel plant in Scunthorpe. It was a very industrialist view.
There was, and it almost felt a little patronising.
You're absolutely right that I think one thing that does grate slightly is, even through Keir Starmer himself, comes from a working class background, that the ways in which he deploys images to talk about working people are all, if not caricatures, certainly stereotypes. So chippies, yeah, absolutely. The only working people are people who are working in shipyards, steel yards, and car manufacturers. When he meets a working class woman in Oldham, it's a rich tea biscuit.
Yeah, and a cuppa.
And a cuppa. Yes, she's not having a matcha latte and a Lamington. In the same way, the moment of patriotism to which he always returns is the Euros in 1996, as though the only time that any working person is capable of actually feeling their heart move with affection for their country is in a football stadium.
Well, maybe that's because he's a soulless man who has no hinterland. And for him, the only way to feel moved is with the football. So perhaps he assumes that's how everybody else feels too.
Oh, that's the striking thing, that there's no poetry in the way in which Keir Starmer approaches the world. And while his speech, I think, was probably rhetorically better constructed than some, but I don't think it comes at all naturally to Starmer when it comes to not just poetry, but music, drama, landscape. He apparently favours holidaying in the Lake District, which, again, great, but it again seems something of a cliche. No disrespect to Westmoreland, but still. And you never get a sense that when he talks about patriotism, that it moves beyond a few particular, political principles about inclusivity. Yeah, fair enough. And football.
I really enjoyed Yvette Cooper talking about patriotism. That was really funny. Did you see the interview that she did recently with the BBC where she said that she had St George's flags, Union flags, St George's bunting, I think, and a Yorkshire Rose flag. And she had them all in her house,
yes,
which made her house sound like one of those like weird souvenir shops that you get near Buckingham Palace, And she was like, I'm never. And then Sir Keir was like, I'm never without a flag. Like, I'm always sitting in front of a flag. And you're like, are you always sitting in front of a flag? Like, when you go to the loo, are you sitting in front of a flag? Do you take it with you to the football match and sit in front of it? They've overkilled. They are overcorrecting, and they make them sound crazy. It's interesting, isn't it, Michael, that we have been talking exclusively about Labour and specifically reform, and we haven't once touched upon the Conservative Party, who've almost felt like, I don't know, the silent third party, more silent than the Lib Dems, perhaps. Where does that leave them ahead of their conference, which is beginning later this week?
You're absolutely right. And Keir Starmer, in his speech, almost made a sort of virtue of a patronising aside about the Conservatives. Remember
She thought that was quite funny.
At the end.
I thought it was quite a funny delivery there, which is not his usual way.
But I may be, the wish may be father to the thought, but in a way, it helps the Conservatives that expectations are relatively low and that they go into their conference with this rather bloody scrap between Farage and Starmer. It means that there is an opportunity for them to appear grown up and mature and serious, particularly when we're on the verge of increasing financial pain. That's the challenge for them next week. And Tim Shipman has an interview in this week's magazine with Kemi Badenoch in which she unveils some of the sort of new policy that they'll be developing in this area. I hope that's the case. But you're absolutely right. At the moment, the Conservative Party is the student at the front of the class, diligently getting on with their homework, while Keir Starmer and Nigel Farage are there in the playground, and everyone is around them shouting, "Fight, fight, fight!" And that's where the excitement appears to be, sadly.
Yeah, and when they have won. There have been some victories for the Conservative Party in terms of the party chairman, Kevin Hollinrake. He was really leading the charge on the Angela Rayner stuff, the Mandelson stuff. But what happens is they do some of the digging and keeping it salient and mentioning it in interviews and stuff. And then when eventually they force a resignation, the main beneficiary is Nigel Farage and reform, because people don't necessarily clock that it had anything to do with the Conservative Party. And if it did, it merely adds to the perception that they had already that the Union Party is it's all much of a muchness and none of them can be trusted.
In politics, no good deed goes unpunished. And it's certainly the case that reforming CCHQ, making it an effective attack machine again, having the scalps of these Labour figures, Angela Rayner, Peter Mandelson, potentially Morgan McSweeney, that is all an indication of a more effective Conservative operation. But as you say, at the moment, it reinforces a narrative that reform are taking advantage of. But again, there is only so much that you can do to determine the political weather. You just have to be the best and most effective version of yourself. And there will be a week next week when eyes will be on the Conservative Party. And if the professionalism that we've seen in this sort of underground sapper attack, as they've been attempting to mine the Labour fortress, if that professionalism can be extended to their infantry and cavalry display next week, then we may look at them with fresh eyes.
And what would you like to see from the Conservative Party? What would your advice be?
Everyone says that the last 14 years of Conservative rule were an unmitigated disaster. I think the Conservatives are right to apologise for mistakes and to be clear about what they got wrong. But I also think that Conservatives need to recover something of their own confidence in the things that they did get right and some of the judgments that were correct. And I think that the other thing also is to be, as Kemi often has been actually, realistic about what serious work government is and what thoughtful endeavour it requires, because and this is something we might touch on in future weeks, my biggest concern, fear, worry about reform is how woefully unprepared they are for government, and in particular for radicalism in government, and how little, notwithstanding Danny Kruger's adhesion to their cause, how little so many of them appear to appreciate what a massive challenge they would be taking on. And the damage, of course, to the Conservatives that accrues from proximity to government and a record of disappointment also actually means that they have the experience and understanding of what's required to drive change. Now, that may be too unpalatable an argument for many, but I think that there has to be a place in politics for seriousness.
And while we've been in Liverpool soaking up the Labour Party conference and enjoying some tepid wine, Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu were potentially redrawing the map of the Middle East. The pair met in Washington to agree on a 20-point roadmap that Donald Trump had proposed for ending the war in 2 years. This includes a long-term truce deal, the release of all the hostages, the withdrawal of the IDF from Gaza, and a new peace board, an organisation of various experts and international representatives, which includes Tony Blair and headed by Donald Trump, to actually take control of governing Gaza. I was absolutely astonished by this. I'd love to hear your thoughts, Michael.
It does seem like a fever dream. It does seem like this is the sort of worst acid trip that Jeremy Corbyn could ever endure, to imagine Donald Trump and Tony Blair together as the colonial masters of Gaza, and to see his friends in Hamas dispossessed literally of their arms and politically of power. But there are, I think, some very serious points to be made about this initiative. It's easy to mock. Trump is a figure of mockery for most people in the UK, and Tony Blair a discredited figure for almost as many in the UK. But Trump succeeded in his first term with the Abraham Accords in persuading Arab states, the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco and others, to recognize Israel and to change the dynamic. What he's done here is use the personal relations that he and others have built up with other Arab leaders, particularly in the fulcrum country, which is Egypt, to get behind a plan. And he's also, I understand, said to Netanyahu in private that Netanyahu had to apologize to the Emir of Qatar for the attack that he launched on Qatar a couple of weeks ago. So he's used this sort of property dealer type relationship that he has with the sheikhs, and he's also used the fact that Israel is dependent on American military support to put together a deal that Netanyahu and the Arab states support. And, in that sense, the odds are high. It will be tough. But I think that the initial reaction of incredulity and ridicule, while it's understandable, shouldn't obscure the scale of the achievements so far.
No. To my mind, the obvious pitfall here is not any of the countries that you mention, because there are obvious, as with the Abraham Accords, Donald Trump can present something that is actually in the interests of the various partners that he's dealing with. The Abraham Accords, it's the promise of a kind of end to this permanent state of war that is actually not good for the economy and is holding back the Middle East from, I guess, approaching modernity and reinvigorating their economies and so forth. So I can understand that, but I just wonder why we're not dealing with necessarily a rational partner when you're dealing with Hamas, an organisation which has in its charter a commitment to destroying all Jews and on occasion is very happy to use its own citizens as human shields. I wonder how they get Hamas to agree to this.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Hamas, on one level, not rational actors because they're driven by ideology.
Or not as, I mean not rational as we would understand it.
No, exactly.
Their incentives are different and they don't take perhaps exactly the same view of even, for example, human life and civilian casualties that other countries would. So it's hard to get into their shoes. Does that make sense?
No, I think this is absolutely 100% correct. So they are rational in that they can calculate what damage a bomb will do. They do study the political pressures both within Israel and across the Arab world with keen attention. So they're not blind maniacs, but what they are is, you're absolutely correct, driven by a different set of judgments about the worth of human life and about the importance of totalitarian political Islam in their ideology, which do make them different. And I think this is one area where you are spot on, and generations of diplomats have completely failed to appreciate what one is dealing with. Because, yes, it will often be the case that leaders, whether in the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, or whatever, will be thinking, how can I make myself and my people richer? That is not the principal aim of Hamas. It's corrupt, but the principal aim is ideological. And it's only if you have someone like you who understands ideology and understands in particular how religion can influence ideology to make people calculated fanatics, that you are aware of the difficult material that we're dealing with here.
For Trump, I suppose you could argue that it's a high risk for him as well and his reputation.
Yes.
Because on the one hand, it's a bit of a paradox. On the one hand, he is reverting to type. US presidents in their second term often pivot towards foreign policy, having been more domestically focused, and often this involves in some kind of foreign adventure that doesn't always work out fantastically well. Donald Trump obviously wants to win a Nobel Peace Prize. And I think he sees this as a great coup. I think it kills him that Barack Obama got a Nobel Peace Prize, frankly, before he'd actually done anything, which was quite an interesting choice of theirs. So there's that. But what I also find really interesting is that it's almost like we've gone away. We sort of reverted to almost a different era of foreign policy. It's that great power politics where you have all of these kind of equal partners, various nations being invited to take part in a peacekeeping effort. It's like something the League of Nations might have proposed in the 1920s or something, or like the team of countries that intervened on the Boxer Rebellion. What's interesting is that although America is kind of in charge, it's not classic American foreign policy style where they say, this is what we're going to do and you guys are going to follow us. It's more like we're all equal partners here, and there'll probably be all kinds of delegates. I imagine I wouldn't be surprised if there was a kind of EU delegate, probably a Jordanian, maybe even a Russian. Who knows? It's Trump. It's weirdly quite an internationalist move from Trump, I would say.
Again, the contrast with George W. Bush, who was Tony Blair's last Republican presidential riding buddy, is marked. You're correct that it's often the case that presidents, particularly Republican presidents, engage in foreign escapades in their second term that end badly. But the difference between Trump and W is that W himself is actually an ideologue, in that he believed that the spread of democracy, whether at the point of a gun or through propaganda, would, across the Middle East, transform the way in which traditional conflicts had been operating, and that he could, using American military muscle and moral example, make the Middle East a sort of an extension of Eastern Europe, countries that had once been mired in autocracy and which became democracies almost overnight. We now know that that was naive. And Donald Trump, you're right, has reverted to actually an older, more classical form of foreign policy, which is let's look at states, let's look at their leaders, let's look rationally at their interests. Let's not try to look at it through a moral film. Let's not try to give foreign policy an ethical framework, as it were. Let's deal with the world as it is. And in the Middle East, there are lots of guys who are playing the odds, and there are some other guys who are just causing trouble. Let's say to those who want to cut a deal, this can be win-win. And let's say to the troublemakers, get out of town, or me and the others are just going to end your racket.
But it's the thing about Donald Trump is that in one of his most recent, obviously we all know that ego and vanity play a large part in his kind of political makeup. His reputation means the world to him. I noticed that, that recent press conference he did with Keir Starmer where he said, Putin's let me down, man. It was almost like he was talking about like an angry ex talking about how he'd been mistreated. I think he felt particularly wounded because it was an assault on his reputation as someone who's able to bring people together and kind of corral them by hook or by crook and then patch something together. It's that kind of wheeler-dealery element that he has. If this doesn't work out, I don't know, it has the potential to really, really threaten that reputation that he has.
Yes, and he has obviously staked an enormous amount on it. There's been an enormous amount of work behind the scenes by his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and a variety of others. And of course people will be cynical, but I'm inclined, as I indicated at the beginning, to give him the benefit of the doubt, because for years now, we've had the Foreign Office mainstream, the former national security advisors and UN ambassadors, the Peter Ricketts and Kim Darrachs of this world, lovely people all, prating on about a two-state solution and their various loved peace processes and looking down their nose at Donald Trump. And they've got precisely nowhere. And therefore, something different and audacious, I think, is worth a try. And it's certainly the case that he seemed to have achieved more, potentially, than they managed by, their particular conventionally minded Chatham House, preachy sort of milquetoast vanilla approach. So, in that sense, thinking unconventionally when conventional thinking hasn't got us out of this mess has a lot to be said for it.
What then explains the presence of Tony Blair, a person who embodies that way of thinking perhaps better than any single person from Britain?
I think Tony Blair has evolved. I'm not saying it's necessarily a good or a bad thing, and arguably he was always like this. Tony Blair is far more a cynical Machiavel than many people have acknowledged. He's far more someone who appreciates and understands the exercise of power than an idealist. And while he draped himself in the clothes of a crusader in the past, the truth is, as his recent book Leadership shows, he is far more of a realist. He's far more a student of Bismarck and Metternich than he would have felt comfortable admitting when he was in government. And that may mean that there are some people who would say that the last remaining shred of what was admirable about Tony Blair has now gone. But I think that it is better to look at politicians over the course of their careers to discern through their actions what they are really like and what one should really rate about them. And in Blair's own memoirs, it's clear that many of the things that he's blamed for and should be blamed for, like the Freedom of Information Act, devolution, the Human Rights Act, he didn't actually really believe in. He adopted them because that was what, either his pupilmaster Derry Irvine believed was right, or the Labour movement more broadly thought was part of the zeitgeist. But he was far more interested in the exercise of power, reforming public services, reconciling labour to a market economy, and so on. So he's actually a more complicated and intriguing figure than the caricature. But I don't think there'll be anyone in the ranks of the current Labour Party who will find him or his participation in this particularly admirable. But I think it's better at this stage to try to analyse rather than condemn.
The Harry Potter star, Emma Watson, has given an interview to a podcast recently in which she said that she had effectively disowned J.K. Rowling, but also, interestingly, seemed to be saying that actually she still kind of cared for J.K. Rowling and still loved her. She says, "It is my deepest wish that people who don't agree with my opinion will love me, and I hope I can keep loving people with whom I don't necessarily share the same opinion with." And it was all very kind of hello trees, hello sky, let's all be friends. J.K. Rowling has then followed this up with an astonishing long tweet in which she talks about, frankly, sharing some quite personal stuff about her relationship with Emma Watson, and how she was taken aback by the extent to which Emma Watson didn't just critique her ideas, but seemed to have disowned her as a person and spoken of her as an immoral individual. And it's interesting because J.K. Rowling has actually kept very stum on how she feels about Daniel Radcliffe and Emma Watson. So this felt a bit like, I don't know, pistols at dawn.
Emma Watson and Daniel Radcliffe owe everything to J.K. Rowling. They are, I'm sure, good actors and, nice to those
I'm
around
not so
them,
sure.
But neither of them has starred in or been responsible for anything as impactful or dramatically significant as their childhood roles in the film versions of J.K. Rowling's novels. And their idea of gratitude was when J.K. Rowling was being vilified for being a gender-critical feminist, to join in the punishment beating being administered to J.K. Rowling. Emma Watson, when she was being given an award, made some clever reference to this award is for all the witches. So, she was deliberately, trying to make a point that trans women are women and that J.K. is on the wrong side of history. Reach for the sick bag. So some people will think there is Emma Watson being sweet and nice and conciliatory and extending the hand of friendship and love to J.K. Rowling. And there is J.K. Rowling, the wicked stepmother of children's fiction, spurning this offer. But actually, even though I'm a great believer generally in forgiveness, generosity, and letting bygones be bygones, I'm completely with Jo Rowling on this one. What Emma Watson and Daniel Radcliffe should do and should have done is just say, we got this wrong. We're really sorry. One might think, what does it matter what actors say about a novelist? But it does matter because J.K. Rowling was being incredibly brave in a debate, as she quite rightly points out, where the victims have been women who don't have the wealth or connections to be able to insulate themselves from predatory men posing as women who've entered women's spaces.
And some of the things that J.K. Rowling has shared really do lay bare, I think, the extent to which Emma Watson behaved in a craven manner. She apparently, after J.K. Rowling did her initial tweet that sparked all of this, in which she basically set out her views, her gender-critical beliefs, while still making the point that trans-identifying people should be treated with respect and kindness, but ultimately it's not possible for people to change sex, which is just an expression of scientific fact. She received an astonishing amount of vitriol, rape threats, death threats, online torment. And Emma Watson apparently got a mutual acquaintance to pass J.K. Rowling a note that said, "I'm so sorry for what you're going through." Without reaching out to her directly, she would have J.K. Rowling's number and didn't bother to get in touch and say, sorry, that's horrible. Making the kind of pronouncements that you mentioned, like the award ceremony thing. What I found really annoying about that was she didn't just say, I'm here for all the witches. She explicitly says, I'm here for all the witches, bar one. I guess meaning J.K. Rowling, the inventor of the world that gave her absolutely everything. It's also interesting that Emma Watson decided to give this interview at all. I think it's a measure of the fact that the debate has shifted.
There are some people who say that actors shouldn't involve themselves in political debates. To what extent does an actor have any greater validity in a political conversation than anyone else, and they shouldn't use their celebrity to advance a position? I don't take that absolutist view, but it is far too often the case that actors follow bandwagons, that they want to be fashionable and zeitgeisty, and there was a period when making the argument that trans women are women was where the zeitgeist was. Daniel Radcliffe and Emma Watson wanted to be there. J.K. Rowling stood bravely against that on an issue of principle. The zeitgeist moves, as you say, following the Supreme Court ruling, and then suddenly it's no longer quite so chic to be in that position. And they also realise that as the debate has moved on, perhaps they should reframe themselves in order to, make sure that their profile continues to look good in an Overton window that has shifted. So they shift with it. I actually have a greater degree of respect for those actors whose political views I don't share, who have been consistently and remain consistently political advocates for unfashionable positions. So Samuel West, who I was at university with. Sam West is someone who is very firmly on the Ken Loach Corbynite left, passionate about the environment and climate change. He has consistently used the opportunities that his fame has given him to argue for that position. And even though I may disagree, he's a sincere and very thoughtful advocate. That I admire. What I find problematic are those people who regard political views like fashion accessories.
I also think we don't fully understand just how much with some celebrities there is an expectation that they express a view that is either woke or they shouldn't express a view at all. I wonder if this is because actors genuinely believe this, celebrities genuinely believe this, or is it the case that the ones who have some kind of dissenting view that may get them into trouble? The entertainment industry is big on cancellation. Do they just not say anything?
Yes.
Do they keep their views to themselves?
One person, though, in the roster of Harry Potter stars that I do want to, even though this may ruin his career, praise is Tom Felton, who played Draco Malfoy, because he backed J.K. Rowling both as a great writer and for giving him a leg up in his career and for her views. Now, this has reinforced a view that I have, which is even more unfashionable than political conservatism, which is, if I had gone to Hogwarts, I would have hoped that the Sorting Hat would have put me in Slytherin. Because
I'm sure it would have done, Michael.
Probably no controversy there. Because
I know I'm in Slytherin because I took the Pottermore quiz and it said I was, so we're both Slytherins.
Slytherins unite. As it turns out, the other houses have let J.K. Rowling down. And Alan Rickman, God bless his memory, and who, of course, played Severus Snape, and Tom Felton as Draco Malfoy, very different figures, but Slytherin forever.
Well, I've always said you can't trust Gryffindors because they're so worthy in the books, at least. The Gryffindors do really stupid things. Like, for example, in the fourth book, The Goblet of Fire, during the Triwizard Tournament, they have, in the second task, they all have a hostage who's been taken to the bottom of the Hogwarts Lake, and they all have to rescue their hostage and bring them back safely. But Harry, being a Gryffindor, decides that it would actually be a very good idea to not take your hostage and take them above to the top of the lake, but to wait at the bottom of the lake until all the hostages have been rescued. So he's trying to be a hero. It's actually quite stupid because in that moment, Harry is saying that Professor Dumbledore would have actually let them all drown if they weren't found within the hour limit. But it's just classic, pointless, goody two-shoes heroism for the sake of it.
Virtue signaling. That is the problem with Gryffindor.
A word for Robbie Coltrane as well, because he plays Hagrid, who is also a Gryffindor.
Oh, yes.
And I think he also stood by J.K. Rowling. And I don't think that it was done, as with Tom Felton, who I felt that when he was being interviewed, they tried to draw him so that he would say something overtly political, but he basically refused. He didn't express a view on gender identity. He just said, I like J.K. Rowling as a person, and I think she's done a great deal of good for the world. But in a way, I'm glad that someone expressed a view there, which many people have, which is a lot of people aren't particularly political in this world. And yet there is an insatiable demand for everyone to have an opinion on everything and for everyone to be political at every time.
Yes, for the political sorting hat to put people into particular houses or tribes, when there are lots of people who would say, actually, I don't want to get involved in that conflict or that fight, whether it's Farage versus Starmer or J.K. Rowling versus Emma Watson. I wish them all well. It would be interesting to know if we could sort our politicians or other leading public figures into particular houses, which one they would be, which one would Keir Starmer be in, which one would Kemi Badenoch be in. We might return to that topic. In fact, listeners might well have their own views about whether or not Hufflepuff or Ravenclaw are more represented on the Conservative or the Labour benches. For anyone who does want to make the argument for why it is that Keir Starmer is Gryffindor and why it might be that Wes Streeting is Slytherin, email us at podcast.spectator.co.uk. We'd love to hear your feedback, and we look forward very much to you joining us next week when we are at the Conservative Party conference, not in Hogwarts, but in Manchester. And Maddie and I will be heading up there, not from platform 9 3/4 at King's Cross, but from Euston Station, and our reflections will follow next week.